Il m'a dit qu'il s'appelait Ricardo.
There's something that can explode and kill you in your car.
This is the device that's supposed to prevent you from being injured, yet it's what's killing people.
People do not understand what they are dealing with here.
They have every information, every dirty detail, and you have no control over who has this information now, what will they do with this information. It's like dynamite.
If the computer that controls the oxygen is not working, the hospital will pay the ransom. Why? Because people are about to die.
This particular program, Clearview AI, is the second most accurate face recognition platform in the world, the first being a program that's run by the Chinese Communist Party.
Miami police say they use Clearview on all sorts of cases, from murders to shoplifting.
Today and tomorrow in Wellington, a documentary film festival that on the surface seems extremely niche.
This is a pretty specific and kind of weird idea.
But actually, it's about something that increasingly seems to be creeping into all of our lives.
The figures on it last year, about $200 million lost.
This film festival isn't for movie buffs, but bankers, lawyers, police officers, and anyone else who deals with scammers. I'm Gwen McClure, and today on The Detail, Wellington's Fraud Film Festival, and why we need it. As the producer and programmer of the festival, Steve Newell is the guy charged with choosing what films to show.
Once you kind of zoom back from the sort of specifics of scams or individuals committing fraud-related crimes, you sort of start to think that so many documentaries actually contain a kind of fraud of one kind or another. And as we've seen with our programming over the years, there's a lot of stuff that sort of manages to fit within the themes of what we like to share with our guests and attendees that, is a little bit beyond the kind of Netflix scammer type genre.
Tell me more about that. What else fits under the umbrella?
I think we sort of stretch that a couple of interesting ways in this year's program. Romance scams are definitely on the rise. We've seen a lot of public outreach by banks and other fraud prevention outfits in recent years, but it's still something that has a much more sort of personal impact that's a little bit removed from, say, the financial or even the criminal. So in this year's program, we've got a documentary called The Man with 1,000 Faces, which is a much more kind of, I guess, victim-centric investigation into a chap who kind of juggled a bunch of women at any one time.
Lui, il était argentin, très romantique.
And while they'd have financial repercussions from it, it's really about the emotional impact that this had on them. So sort of sits a little bit aside documentaries that have a bit more of a focus on the kind of numerical scale of offending and much more about the personal. Another example is Stasi FC, which looks at fraud in sport, but not so much from the viewpoint that we might be used to, which would be things around, maybe match fixing or doping type scandals. It looks at politics in sport.
He wanted a successful Berlin football team to reinforce the power of the Stasi.
Here in New Zealand, we've heard the drum beaten for years about there shouldn't be politics in sport, whether it's protests against the Springbok tour or more recently TJ Perenara's last haka for the All Blacks. We kind of keep hearing about politics in sport, and there's no place for it. Stasi FC is about the East German secret police who inject themselves into sport in the 70s, trying to stamp out football as a place for freedom of expression and dissent.
East Germany had the most densely populated secret police in the entire world.
How that becomes a fraud is in the manipulation of football results, really as much as anything else, to kind of prove that the state can and will control anything in an autocratic regime. These are films that bring interesting cinematic techniques that would be interesting, I think, for a whole bunch of viewers. I love the fact that we're using them to pull out some, really crucial discussions about how New Zealanders can be safer and more alert to challenges in this kind of space.
I think I should ask you to define fraud.
That's a very good question. And let me see. How would I define fraud?
Yeah, because you're looking at films that sort of fit into this category. Your definition, your personal definition, probably varies a little bit.
For me, fraud is a deception that's been with human beings as long as we've had the ability to communicate with one another. It probably predates spoken language, right? It's in our day-to-day lives in so many different ways. Once you start pulling on the thread of what constitutes fraud, as I guess I've done as a programmer, sort of what fits the parameters of this event, you kind of see that there's these, micro deceptions all through our lives, whether it's something that you might want to categorize as politeness, right through to ripping off someone's life savings. It's there, and we need to be aware of a whole bunch of different facets of it if we're going to navigate it successfully. It's not something that we're going to be able to remove from human nature. These are just elements of the human condition and our ability to lead both internal and external lives that aren't always in sync.
William Fotherby is a partner at law firm Meredith Connell, where he specializes in white-collar crime and fraud. He works with victims of fraud, people and companies. He's also the chair of the Fraud Film Festival. His definition is a bit more legal.
It is obtaining money or other property by deception.
He says there are many different ways that can be done, and many players who can be involved, to varying degrees of culpability.
If you have a victim and a fraudster, and there are other people within that context who might be able to prevent the fraud happening, what is their responsibility? So banks and social media companies and telecommunication providers.
How common do you think fraud is in New Zealand? Are we seeing a lot of it?
Yeah, I think it is very, very common. I think the figures on it last year, about $200 million lost to fraud. And the real problem is so many people feel very, very foolish, having realized that they have been the victim, that they don't report it.
My first thought upon realizing what had happened was, I'm such a fool.
Choosing rather just to try to cut their losses and hope that no one finds out about their foolishness. And that's a real problem for a couple of reasons. One, you're starting at a disadvantage because unlike an assault, for example, where if you were to assault me, I know immediately that I've been the victim of a crime. Fraud actually takes a bit of uncovering. So you're starting at a disadvantage because the victim first has to realize that they've been defrauded, and then they need to make a decision about what they're going to do about it. And as I said, a lot of people decide, well, I don't really want to relive my foolishness, and therefore I'm not going to report it. But the problem with that is it prevents the publicity that is very useful to prevent this type of fraud in the first place. And certainly I see the underreporting as one of the reasons why the levels of fraud are still so high.
The only way to stamp out scams is if victims actually feel safe to report crime. Victims need support, not condemnation.
What are some of those scams currently? What are we worried about? What are you seeing?
I am concerned about a number of them. One is the pretty classic, give me a large amount of money and I'll invest it in cryptocurrency and you'll get a significant return in 1 or 2 or 3 years' time. And by the way, you have to pay the money into a foreign bank account, usually through a remittance company. And the problem is once the money goes out of New Zealand, it is very difficult to recover. The second thing which I am seeing more and more is just the creation of fake websites which mirror well-known retailers. And then the third thing I think is very common, but we're just going to continue to see a lot of it, are these romance scams, or what are called pig butchering scams.
And we're back now with the FBI putting out a warning about what's called pig butchering. Has nothing to do with bacon or ham.
It has to do with people using apps and social media to gain your trust and clean out your bank accounts.
Basically, they contact you sort of out of the blue, either through social media or a text message, and they try to draw you into a conversation. And it's a long con, right? They try to build a relationship with you over a long period of time. The more they get to know you, the more they learn about you, your needs, your vulnerabilities. And when they get to a point where they feel they have your trust, they'll say, well, gee, we have such a close relationship, or I know you need money for retirement. I have this really good idea, guaranteed you're going to make huge returns, solve all your problems, and I'm only giving this to you because we're so close. And so you give them money, and they keep asking, and they keep the relationship going until you don't have any more money, or you ask to withdraw something. Then they disappear with your money.
These messages come from overseas, often Southeast Asia, and there is a whole industry devoted to this type of scam aimed at countries like New Zealand. The complex and quite sad part of it is not only are people being defrauded out of significant sums of money, but the person who has sent you that message might often be the victim of a form of human trafficking already. And there are reported compounds of people in places like Vietnam who are essentially forced to make these types of messages, send them out, and if they don't get a certain level of performance, then that can have an effect on their own person, and they might be subject to violence. So I think it is very important for people to know that there is a whole industry which is a genuine criminal enterprise, which to a certain extent enslaves people to try and defraud others in countries like New Zealand. And there is no sign that in the future it's going to get any less sophisticated or it's going to get smaller. At the moment, it's industrialized and organized. And again, that's why just making as many steps as we can towards publicizing the different types of scams out there and how they are put together is very, very important.
A few weeks ago, my colleague Alexia Russell did a podcast about New Zealand's worsening ranking on the Corruption Perception Index. The CEO of Transparency International New Zealand, Julia Heggie, said this to her.
We've said for some time, no, there really are risks and we're not really addressing them properly.
I asked William if he agreed that New Zealand isn't doing enough to protect people against scams.
I think we have been a little bit naive and a little bit comfortable about the extent to which we as a nation might be targeted. Mm-hmm. And you can sort of understand why that is, because we have the privilege of living in a peaceful, relatively crime-free society, which is so small that there's a self-regulating quality to that. So everybody knows everybody, and it's just a bit more difficult to commit fraud. But with the advent of large-scale frauds coming from overseas, and because of the increasing amount of time we spend online, and again because of this tendency to underreport, it might not have been given the prominence it deserves. I think, in fairness, that is changing. It's not an easy problem to solve because there are a number of people in the chain that sort of need to work together. So that is a combination of law enforcement and other government agencies, but also banks and telecommunications companies and social media platforms. And coordination between a number of different parties is difficult. They all have different initiatives designed to prevent fraud, but it's not like it could be fixed by one person.
But do you think that we need some frameworks in place? I mean, do we have the frameworks kind of government-wise?
There is quite good coordination done within government, but I think where the room for improvement might be is between the public sector and the private sector. And again, I don't think that's easy because there will be arguments about whose responsibility certain things should be, but just recognizing that there is public responsibility and private responsibility, and it works best if everybody is coordinating, I think would certainly solve some of the problems that have been identified.
I realize I need to ask you what people should do if they either know that they've been defrauded or they think they've been defrauded. And I suppose in that too, if they think that they've received a text with the intention of defrauding them, even if they haven't fallen for it.
There are basic things you can do. The first one is be very skeptical of anything unsolicited. So emails, texts, calls, anyone you don't know. But it's just that sort of moment of due diligence that you need to do. The next thing I'd say is, I sort of make no apology for saying it a number of times, if you think you've been defrauded, then report it as soon as possible. So talk to your bank. I think, to the bank's credit, their sort of fraud reporting lines are pretty good and they can be pretty quick. And if you can act quickly, then you can often prevent money going out of your account. But yeah, as I've said a number of times, it's just the fact of under-reporting that makes everybody's life more difficult. The final thing I'd say is you also have to be quite wary of the secondary industry, which is designed to try and affect a further fraud on you. And the way it works is you have been scammed, and you sort of Google it, have I been scammed? And the answer is, yes. And then other people will contact you saying, oh, I see you've been scammed, or I understand you think you might be scammed. I can help you get your money back, and all you need to do is pay me further money, and I'm confident that I'll be able to get a recovery for you. There is a genuine secondary industry, and it's a further layer of scamming designed to react to that situation and get further money out of you that way.
This film festival has been going since 2016. Do you think the fraud landscape in New Zealand has changed since then? Is it better, worse?
It's certainly different. It's certainly more sophisticated, and I would be hesitant to say it's better or worse, because if you lose $500,000 to fraud, it sort of doesn't matter how that has happened. But I think the most important thing from my point of view is the festival is still relevant and fulfills an important public purpose, and it looks like there'll be a good place for us for some years to come, at least.
The Wellington Festival started when a New Zealander working for Deloitte went to Amsterdam, where the original Fraud Film Festival is, and returned to start one here. Steve Newell has been involved since the beginning. I asked him what his process is like when it comes to picking films.
It really starts with trying to take an overview of everything that's been happening in documentary for a year or two, and also thinking quite laterally, like as our programming suggests. These aren't just all kind of dry tales of businessmen within companies, cooking the books, or scam artists turning people over one at a time. And that focus has allowed me to explore lots of things. Many films don't make the festival for one reason or another, whether it's for distribution reasons or just timeframes. So it's a really interesting and challenging process to pull together a group of films that all illuminate different areas of this really crucial subject matter.
I was looking at the program for this year. It looks like mostly or all international films. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. And we have played a New Zealand film before. This is probably the first time I really sort of stretched the parameters of what we're doing. And while fraud is redolent in the title I'm about to mention, certainly surprised a few people in the audience by playing David Farrier's Tickled, which explores the world of what's euphemistically called competitive endurance tickling.
Yeah.
It's a little bit more than that, and I think listeners can draw some of their own conclusions about what that might be if they haven't seen the film.
But you still think that the international content is relevant to a New Zealand audience?
Oh, 100%. And there's no geographic boundaries that get in the way of hackers or cryptocurrency scams. The specificity of fraud is also pretty universal. Each will take its own little different flavor. But to further make it relevant to audiences here, we pair each film with an expert discussion panel that follows it. So it gives a real local context to what our audiences have just seen. And, whether it's the specifics of that particular fraud or scam, or an opportunity to talk about analogues here in Aotearoa, it definitely helps, land the punches that the international films are trying to.
That's all for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was produced by Alexia Russell and engineered by Jeremy Veal. Thank you to Steve Newell and William Fotherby. I'm Gwen McClure. Matewa.